And now, as we move into our history moment, I hope that we start to think about the many ways that we have served and will serve as a church. Today's history moment is from Dottie Lewis, our church librarian, who knows quite a bit about education and learning here at First Baptist, having been here for many years. So, Dottie, would you come and bring our history moment?
I hope the mic is in the right place. I don't want to monkey with it. Oh, I hope it's... My part of this history moment that we're celebrating is about the contribution of this church to one of what is the basic missions of any Baptist church, and that's study and learning. Now, not just Bible study, but all study and learning. I have a saying that I sort of copted from some other places. Baptists cover you from the cradle to the grave for the life beyond. I've always said libraries cover your life from the cradle to the grave. Now we have so many books about reading to your babies, we cover you before you are in the cradle. In the very first early stages of the Baptist denomination, there's always been Bible study and education for everyone. Now, not everybody thought that a college degree was necessary for a thing, but reading, writing, and arithmetic was. And so it was all the lives that were touched by Baptists were always an inward standard and an outreach goal to make sure they could read, write, and add and subtract. As John pointed out last week, FBC's had a remarkable number of advanced educational visionaries and practical and gifted leaders. But you got to accept from the beginning that this was not the norm, and we were never exactly like the regular Baptist churches that you would run into. Because like attracts its own like, FBC leaders who were in this church chose leaders who reflected and accepted like principles. From its beginning, this church was considered different. So face up to that. It's always been that way, even considered rebel at some points in our history. This talk got to be kind of Herculean for me in the first place because as my research progressed, I saw it grew longer and longer and longer. Well, 140 years is a long time, so I'm not going to cover all of that, rest assured. But what I did choose to emphasize was the oldest part of the history because there seemed to be not a lot of people who can recall it up. Just looking out over the congregation, I see one other person who's been here as long as I have, and that's Marie Potter Dalton. She and I are, there's Jane. Jane Mice. So there are three of us here this morning who might be able to remember some of the things from the old times. We do hope that we will pick up the history from where it's written in this book and write another history. Dr. Reynolds, when he was here, encouraged us to do that. But we haven't done it yet. But I do encourage you to look at these two histories. I think they've gathered some of them, and there are 2 copies in the library. And the other history that covers, besides the regular church history, is one that I've just discovered that we have lots of copies of if anybody's interested, and that's the history of the Charles B. Kazee Educational Fund. Since we're emphasizing education today, that's why I have them up. The history, I have to give a little plug for this because my sister is the one who created it from all of the research that the committee did back in 1984 when we had the centennial. And she made it so that it's easy to read and interesting, and we did manage to have a few pictures that, if you haven't seen it, but it does take you straight through the history. And then Dr. Korn's book, of course, is very readable if you remember him and how he spoke. His books and all the books that he wrote, 9, I think, we have some of those too. So look out for they're sort of alike, but not exactly the same size. FBC began its remarkable journey in about 1883 when Clarence P. Kerfoot stepped off the newly opened Danville and New River Railroad train. At that time, it was a 4-hour trip from Danville on the train. I have a hard time imagining that, but that's what it said in the history, so I'm buying it, a 4-hour trip. He was first an apprentice, and then he attended the National College of Pharmacy, which is now part of Georgetown University. And fortunately for us, upon opening his own drugstore here in Martinsville, he went to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to wed Rebecca Kratz. Lucy, lucky for us, Mrs. Kratz's mother had formed a Baptist church in Martinsburg. So she had that experience. So when she came here and there wasn't any Baptist church, she took a page out of her mother's book and contacted the State Mission Board of Virginia and the Blue Ridge Association, and this church came into being on April the 10th, 1884. I don't think that's today, is it? And she went through all the proper channels, and that was so that she had all the proper help. Now I want you to take note, everybody. The very next Sunday, Mrs. Eliza Griggs held a Sunday school at her home. That's next week, 1 week later. So education starts right off the bat. They soon outgrew Mrs. Griggs's home, and for some years they met in the Ruffner Institute. And the reason I add this is because it was a public type elementary school. This is before public education for elementary and secondary students. That building was still there when I was a little girl, or at least part of it was still up. So we always all knew why it was called College Street. But in case you've ever wondered, that's why. There did used to be a college there. But once public education came into being, they didn't need it anymore. Mrs. Kerfoot is quoted as saying, from the very beginning, this is the quote, the Sunday school was the most encouraging feature of our church work. Our first minister was a Reverend R.D. Haymore, and he stayed not quite a year, I think. And then a Reverend Calvin Jones came, and the church was meeting once a month at that time, and they were meeting in the Presbyterian church. Oh, it was really nice of the other churches to share with us, because we didn't have a building. We must have certainly outgrew the Kerfoot home. And so it was really, they must have met once a month, so their church was free for us to use once a month. Apparently, we also sometimes met in the Methodist church. Oh, I didn't find that in the history. That's before what is a signature event. During that time, we don't have a whole lot of what happened with Reverend Jones, so that now we get to another eventful year, which is 1888, when Reverend S.J. Fuller came. This is really a signature event. Reverend Fuller had been a circuit riding minister and had a large area all around Floyd and the counties around, and it got worn out. And so he was happy to accept when Reverend Jones left to come to us. Now, it appears that he still had some responsibility for those churches on the circuit, but he had a permanent home, and he came here with his wife and 2 daughters. And that would be Miss Annette and Miss Hasseltine. Under Fuller's tenure, the very first year he was there, they formed a WMU. That's just 2 years after the Sunday school. And so that's 3 years after the church was founded. So you see, they got into the education part right away. Also under Mr. Reverend Fuller's tenure, they built had got their first building. I don't know how they finally collected all the money, and that's in one of the pictures that we have around somewhere that shows the Kerfoot home and then the Broad Street Church and then the First Baptist Church. So that within 4 years of founding and the whole thing in a cottage, we had an own building with a bell tower and a bell. And you saw how the children got it last week. They asked, why do you think they had a bell? And they said, it's to tell people it's time to come to church. So they got it right away. I thought that was really great. So far, I've not been able to confirm what actually happened to that building, but I know that I was always told that it burned. But it didn't burn while we had it. We'd already moved on. And so it was. I think another church had it, but I've not been able to. If anybody knows, let me know. But I do think it burned, and it was just behind where the old church was. There's a brick building there beside that parking lot. It has offices, and it used to have apartments in it. And I think it just has offices in it now, and it was on that spot. But we outgrew that. So they had to get busy. After the Fullers came, I guess Miss Hasseltine and Miss Annette went off and got their education, and then they came back to Martinsville and founded the classic female institute or academy, seminary, classic female seminary, which was sort of funny and regular in those days because girls didn't get much of a chance to learn to read and write. And they ran from 1897 until 1912. Miss Hasseltine got married and moved away, and Miss Annette kept it up until 1912. I remember Miss Annette. I do not remember Miss Hasseltine, and I don't remember S.J. Fuller either. But I knew all about them because they were a constant topic, even though they were gone by the time I got into, say, singing in a choir or anything like that. So, but my sister did remember, and I do remember Miss Annette because she went on for a long time. I think we should take note here at this point in the history that in 1890, Charles B. Kazee moved to Martinsville. And then he married Olivia Simmons, who was from Floyd, Virginia. in later, 1896. Then after S.J. Fuller died, his wife stayed in Martinsville, and that's why Miss Annette and Miss Hazelton came back, they think. Reverend Hugh Smith came after that, and I don't remember him either, but we have to understand that when he was here, the Sunday school grew from 75 attendees to 112, and his wife formed the Sunbeams. Were you ever a Sunbeam? Maybe you're not older. I see some people nodding their heads. I was a Sunbeam, and that went on for quite a while. But that was also a process of education and learning and Bible study. That's what they did if you don't know what Sunbeams did. But they were sort of preschool to maybe first grade. Then a very important person came whose name was E.L. Grace. This is in 1902, and his wife Ellie. And they were very highly regarded in the church and in the town. And he steered the church into interest in joining the SBC. I guess that was a good idea. Certainly at the time it was. And he was a very strong proponent of Sunday schools. He said, and I quote, "It's the ideal way of reaching all ages in our community." So we were always pushing education and the way to go. Ellie Grace took an interest in young women, and she gathered them together, and after a while they started calling themselves the Ellie Grace Band. She was apparently very influential with that group, because the Ellie Grace Band went on even after she passed away early on in this, probably about 1905 or 6. She had stillborn twins. She died when she gave birth to stillborn twins. And after that, Reverend Grace left. But the Ellie Grace Band remained until really they were the Ellie Grace Band for a long time, and finally they decided to join the WMU, and they agreed that they would allow themselves to be called Circle 6. But everybody referred to them, and I can remember this, as Ellie Grace. They didn't say band, they just said that she's Ellie Grace. So, and everybody knew what that meant. Then the next big historical event comes in 1907 after E.L. Grace, which is Dr. James P. McCabe. And John described him very well. And of course, I grew up under him, so he was very familiar. And I will take a moment with him because he was into everything. It didn't make any difference whether it was education or whatever it was. Dr. McCabe was there. He knew what was going on, and everybody loved him, and he loved him back. And he was, I don't want to say gentle exactly, but he was easy to get along with. He was hail fellow well met in town, and he was, as John said, a walking outreach program. He went down on the square and rounded up people and invited them to church, and he knew all their names and their children's names, and he was just, for such a really short, rotund little man, he was other ways a giant. He exuded pleasantness, and if you haven't looked at the portrait carefully of him in the parlor, it is him to the life. It's exactly what he looked like. And it's, of course, Robert Kerfoot, the Kerfoots were and McCabe were friends, of course, and they were in and out of each other's homes. So Robert Kerfoot knew Dr. McCabe, and so, but the portrait is absolutely perfect. After he came, Dr. McCabe married Sue Martin, that's a local Martin, and she was the perfect pastor's wife. And everybody thought at the time that it was a great catch for both of them. And I never saw Miss Sue out of sorts, and she could meet any challenge with patience. She is the one who began loaning out Dr. McCabe's extensive library for people who wanted to further their study. And thus we have the Sue Martin McCabe Library. That's where that came from, because she started it all. I don't know whether she had as much trouble getting her books back as some libraries do, but she did lend them out. I think I should tell you, because she ordered the spring and fall cleaning every year in the church, and everybody showed up. Nobody ordered it. Was, what do you want me to clean this year, Miss Sue? And I made your assignment. I guess my talk is getting a little long at this point, and I'll try to touch on the highlights without a hold. The next big event was when the Reverend Mr. Hodge came, and he was to assist Dr. McCabe because the church was growing so much and it was gotten too much for him, and he what came as an religious education director, but he graduated from Southwestern Seminary in sacred music. So he and Miss Annette hit it off. Because by that time Miss Annette was the musical director, organist, pianist, whatever you needed in the musical way. She conducted dramas, and David's going to cover her in the music room. I do want to mention in passing the Blue Ridge School, which was founded in 1916, and it was up off Route 8, just at Woolwine, and it was this is what it says. It rates a historical Virginia marker. And it reads, the Blue Ridge Mission School was established by the Virginia Baptist General Convention in 1916. It provided general education and religious training on both the elementary and secondary level for day and boarding students. Its program was increasingly coordinated with, and in 1941 superseded by, the county public school system. The WMU was always supporting the mission school. I can remember we did projects, and there were all kinds of things, so that it was part of their outreach, as it has been all of its life. The next person I want to talk to you is the Kerfoot's son, J. Conrad Kerfoot, known to everybody as Dr. Connie. And he would always say, now, I'm not a doctor, but people called him that. He was a wonderful pharmacist, and everybody loved him, and he loved them back. And he was the traditional Christian Virginia gentleman. And he was a guiding light here. He was superintendent of Sunday schools for 20-some years. And I think he was the treasurer at one time. There's a list in the back of this book of all the ministers, all the treasurers, all the assistant ministers, all the music directors, anybody you want to know about. They're listed in their dates. You have to read the book to find out what it was they did. The next one I will take, of course, the greatest thing we did was the Kazee, was done by Dr. McCabe for Charles Kazee, because he didn't live to see it instituted, and that was the Kazee Fund. I'm not going to attempt to attend that, but it has, I will tell you, it has helped at least thousands of girls and boys to go to college. And it was set up by Dr. McCabe after he died, and it was run by Mrs. Kazee until her passing. So, but to find out about that and how it works is you really have to read the book, and we don't have time for that today. The next person I will talk about, of course, is Mrs. Kessler, who became the librarian. And I've not been able to find out exactly when she started the library, when she started working in the library. We already had a library. Miss Sue had started one, and then we had one that was run by other people, as I guess as they were appointed. I want you to be the librarian this month. But when she was a trained religious education director, I think for the Episcopal Church, the way I remember it, but her first assignment was in a Baptist church in Lockport, Virginia, around Portsmouth. And the minister there was Joe Kessler, and his wife had died and left him with 4 children. So I don't know how long she was the minister there, but that she gave that up and helped him raise those 4 children, and they had 1 child of their own. But she was not trained in library work, so after they asked her to be the librarian, she would go every year to Ridgecrest and take all their library courses, and she took them all. And she was very thorough and very forward-looking. Maybe that's her Episcopal background, but she was not into censorship of any kind, which always surprised people because she was so old-fashioned. She would never tell anybody what her age was. When she died, her own children didn't know how old she was. We were always guessing, and we had a hard time getting her to admit to being past 72 or whatever it is, so we could pay her more money than we were paying her. But the list goes on and on and on, and of course we must include Dr. Horn, who was, of course, another historic event in our church. And it's hard for me to quantify because I grew up under first Dr. McKay, but then Dr. Horn when he came. And he was probably the greatest influence on my life outside of my own family members. And I guess the best way to describe him, and if you knew him, you would feel this, was that he was, Fannie Williams, who was assistant minister to him, said he had the Chevis spirit. And unless you knew him and experienced it, it's very difficult to quantify it and explain it. But if you knew him, it was there. And of course, he was, wrote books and was supportive of all things. And he and Hezekiah Morris single-handedly brought integration peacefully to this town. The list goes on, and we haven't got time for me to talk about any others, but we have other things that we supported as far as education was concerned. Ms. Manson, when she was here, started the ELC, which was she had a kindergarten, and then it turned into, I'm sorry about the book, quite finished. And then we used to have BYPU, if you can remember that, and that was a great teaching unit, and of course the WMU. And those are the things that we can attribute, but that's the early part of the history. The new part, some of it's covered in this book, and then we hope to cover the rest of it in another history and keep up our good work.